I have no apologies for the fact that there's a lot of material that I will be racing through. You have all the slides and you already know all this stuff anyway, and I won't feel bad if I get cut off at the end because I've covered too much. So we're all familiar with the clinical features, early age of onset of colon cancer, but seemingly later and later we're finding people that have susceptibility to colon cancer on the basis of mismatch repair mutations. We still tend to see tumors in the proximal colon, and that's why we have to do colonoscopy. We have a characteristic range of extracolonic tumors, including first and foremost endometrial, but a host of others about whom there's a lot of controversy about what's the real frequency and appropriate screening, and a very characteristic pathology. Poorly differentiated tumors tend to be mucinous, and critically tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes that show microsatellite instability. But we have to remember that HNPCC, and sorry, Rick, I don't use that other word, HNPCC doesn't account for more than about 3% of colorectal cancer, but it is a great paradigm. And it's a great paradigm because of the way it follows the mismatch repair pathway, which when it works, identifies and corrects single and other nucleotide mismatches. But when the mismatch repair genes are not doing their work, we allow mutations to occur, particularly targeting areas that have microsatellite regions, and those become mutated, and interestingly, probably are associated with proteins that themselves are neoantigens that may stimulate a very important immune response that may be a foundation for the development of vaccines, which I think is something that hopefully we'll be talking about over the next day or so. One of the key issues that's already been mentioned is the importance of identifying better screening methods. Currently, and a lot of this is from the NCCN that I've been involved in, the current approach is to take all colorectal cancers, and if tumor is available, do tumor testing either by means of immunohistochemistry or microsatellite testing. But, and I want to really emphasize this, an alternative that has been put on the table for consideration is, even when tumor is available, but certainly when it's not, to consider use of a multi-gene panel, either specific to the mismatch repair genes or probably more broadly including others. And so here's why. So here's a woman that showed up in my clinic a couple of weeks ago, healthy 24-year-old with this family history, prostate cancer in her dad in his 50s, and some breast cancer early onset. So she asked for a breast cancer panel, got an expanded breast cancer panel, and was found to have a PMS2 pathologic variant, even though there had been no colon cancer in her family. We're seeing this all the time. Anybody who deals clinically with these patients is probably seeing cases like this almost weekly. And I certainly see them weekly. So again, on this panel, she was found to, this is a different patient that was found to have an MSH6 mutation, even though, again, no immediate family history of colon cancer. So we're seeing this both in people with other cancers and in the worried well that get subjected to various panel tests. So we have great opportunities and technologies to achieve cancer prevention and control, and that's what we're about here. So I just want to kind of blend in some of the issues that came from the Blue Ribbon panel. First and foremost, deciding who to test and how. We'll be talking about that a lot. Tailoring surveillance by gene. One could argue, does the average practitioner know enough about the nuances of this to be expected to really tailor their surveillance to the differences in penetrance between the various mismatch repair genes? I'll just throw that open as a question because I don't really have a good answer for it. We need a better evidence base for extracolonic surveillance. I'm here to say that right now, outside of the colon, we have no good evidence to support any of the extracolonic screening that we do. We need to find a way to reduce the colonoscopy burden. I spend all day, every day doing this, but I don't find as many polyps and tumors as I'd like, and better screening strategies, perhaps mutated DNA, perhaps liquid biopsies would be appropriate. I'm going to conclude by emphasizing the importance of new approaches to cascade testing. It's already been mentioned that we're not identifying enough at-risk people. And one of my biggest concerns is that even in families when we found a mismatch repair mutation, we do a terrible job identifying those that are at risk within those families. And John Byrne will be talking more about chemoprevention. So the Amsterdam criteria that you probably learned about in medical school, I'm here to say are obsolete. Nobody cares about this anymore because most of the cases that we find that have mutations don't meet the Amsterdam criteria anyway, so forget about them. Also, forget about the Bethesda guidelines. Sorry for those of you that were involved in those. You know, they were helpful at one point, but I think we've transcended most of this in this era of universal testing. We have great algorithms. Kudos to Faye Castrinos, who sort of synthesized nicely kind of the current, one current protocol. Start with young people, do tumor testing. For those that may not be appropriate for tumor testing, use the a priori risk model such as PREM. But we're immediately, and this only came out a couple of years ago, we're already shooting holes in this because we now know that a lot of cases that have loss of MSH2, MSH6, and PMS2, although they may have germline mutations, often can be inactivated somatically, and we don't really have good schemes for routinely identifying those clinically. And the so-called Syndrome X, where's Lainey Linder? The Syndrome X culprit. Okay. So now these may be the ideal candidates for just throwing a panel at things and seeing what happens. Maybe a SMAD4 mutation, maybe MYH. Who knows what we're going to find in some of these families. So a little bit more about the recommendations. Again, you have all of this in the material for those of you that have already read through this to identify and deliver better surveillance for people that have or may have HNPCC, and to develop more focused trials. I was emailing back and forth a little bit with Rick Boland over the last day or so, and he was saying, I hope one of the things that comes out of this is a better way to develop a cohort that we can really focus on genotype, phenotype, and answer some of the biologic questions. And although I'm not smart enough to do that kind of work, I do appreciate that it is very important. So one of the things that we'll be talking about over the next day and a half is a recommendation that we develop, or that somebody develop, a nationwide demonstration project to systematically screen all people diagnosed with colorectal and endometrial cancer. This would seem to me to be suggesting a tumor-based approach, really find a way to push universal testing out into the community. Maybe, but I'm going to be talking about some data that basically says maybe we're already beyond all of that and we should be focusing our resources elsewhere. And again, the emphasis in this was initial screen for mismatch repair and then targeted sequencing. Maybe, maybe not. Let's be provocative about this. So deciding who to test and how, there are a lot of pros and cons with tumor testing. So even if this were cheap enough, at our place we charge a fortune, don't we, Stan, for doing this kind of testing. If we start with tumor-based testing, then is the next step, is this step a standalone test, or is it part of next-gen testing where we test for everything else that could be somatically wrong in a tumor as well? If we're going to do universal testing, how do we do it? Does a clinician order it, or does it start with the pathologist? We're still struggling at our institution over that kind of issue. If the testing is not universal, where do we compromise? Do we cut people off at 70? Do we ignore those with a negative family history? Who knows? What does it cost, and what are the alternatives? This, again, is the NCCN guideline that I've shown in its native form, where, again, we talk about tumor testing or multi-gene panel. And then, so the question is, if there's no tumor available, do we just do focus testing on somebody who looks like they have early onset family history that looks like HNPCC, or because panels are getting increasingly cheap, do we just go ahead and throw a broad panel at people, even though targeted testing may seem to make sense? And at least NCCN is saying, oh, well, we should be willing to try it both ways. One of the problems I have, and I'm a firm believer in tumor-based testing. That's where I come from. I biopsy tumors. I send them for MSI and immunohistochemistry so that our surgeons can make the right choices. And you can't read the details of this, but this is simply to demonstrate all of the ifs, ands, or buts that occur when you do immunohistochemistry. Challenges of the interpretation, false positives, false negatives. I think it's gotten complicated enough that it's a reasonable question, should we be bothering with this as the primary way for identifying and screening patients? Because every one of these plus and minus cells leads to a slightly different result that may overlap with another. And I'll leave the details to people who want to look at the NCCN stuff. So again, to drill down, there are pitfalls in immunohistochemistry interpretation. MSH6 can show patchy staining. MLH1 can still be immunoreactive even when there may be important pathologic mutations. So there are problems with the interpretation of it. And the question, has this gotten to be more trouble than it's worth? So people like Faye Castrinos and others who would say, well, an alternative strategy may be worth considering. Let's look at some of the a priori risk models. Very easy to do. I tend to use these models in my clinic with the worried well that I'm not really sure warrant testing, but in 30 seconds or less, you can plug in enough data about your patient to arrive at a prior probability, and most would argue that regardless of how we feel about universal testing for cancer patients, if somebody meets a 5% or greater prior probability based on some of these models, maybe they deserve testing, and maybe that testing should be panel testing as opposed to just mismatch repair testing. So what about panel testing? I think this is kind of the elephant in the room right now, and we can get some discussion about that. Basically, this is what panel testing is. Basically, very, very broad brush panel testing for underlying mutations. So I want to make another shout out to Matt Yerglin. Congratulations on this really important work, single institution based, but doing panel testing on everybody that showed up with colorectal cancer over a short period of time in Boston. This is the list of all the genes that were in the expanded panel that covers not just mismatch repair, but all the other usual and less usual suspects in people with colorectal cancer. They did tend to have younger patients than we probably see in a non-referral population. But the usual proportion showed evidence of microsatellite instability. So they did the microsatellite testing, but basically they threw a panel at everybody, and the take-home message was that nearly 10%, much higher proportion than we think of as having HNPCC, but nearly 10% of all the people tested had a mutation in what would be considered an actionable gene. That's interesting, but a lot of these were in things like BRCA genes and some of the more moderate penetrants like monoallelic MYH. We're still arguing over how actionable really is monoallelic MYH, but if we find it, we got to tell the people in the community, should we be acting on it, should we not? So maybe we need more data there. So the conclusion really from the study, and thanks again, Matt, for doing this, there is a paragraph in the discussion that absolutely echoes my thinking, which is, as this is getting cheaper and easier to do, maybe we should just throw out the rule book on tumor testing, assume that tumor testing is going to be done for other reasons anyway, but just consider doing panel testing on everybody all the time. Let's move on. What about preventive care? I do colonoscopy. I find little tiny polyps like this. This little tiny polyp wasn't there last year, as near as I can tell, but it had early cancer in it, even though a lot of us might not even see it when it's there. I didn't put a circle around it. We do have good clinical management guidelines. There's good consistency between the ACS, the GI societies, the European group, and NCCN around the central importance of tumor testing, targeted mutation testing, but even of screening, starting early and repeated often. Way more controversy over whether to do any extracolonic screening. So with respect to colon cancer surveillance, what's the right interval? Most of us talk in terms of 1 to 2, and we sort of tailor that to oftentimes the patient's concern, how adequate was the prep. In Finland, they use a 3-year interval. In Israel, being very nice and arbitrary. Instead of saying 1 to 2, they say, okay, let's make it a year and a half. We'll just be arbitrary and call it a year and a half. Can enhanced imaging help? Chromoendoscopy when we do colonoscopy, but are there alternatives like fecal DNA testing, conceivably even CT colonography, but that's probably not going to be helpful in HNPCC. Is it appropriate to start clinical surveillance later in MSH6 and PMS2? I think the age of onset distribution curves probably would say that makes sense. My only concern is this may be too nuanced for the average practitioner to really be able to embrace. And we still, in patients that have had cancer, struggle with the scope of surgery. We have no good studies really showing the benefit of subtotal colectomy versus segmental, and yet most of the data would suggest that more removal of the colon is better, and yet I can't get our surgeons, even the ones in this room, to do the kind of surgery I want them to do. So we still have to struggle with our surgeons about this. No data in support of any particular extracolonic surveillance, even though we have guidelines that we've developed that we adhere to. My practice and that of most GIs is to do an upper endoscopy every other colonoscopy, and the yield, I have to say, has been rather poor, and that's something we probably should be looking at harder. Karen Liu is here, who can probably speak better than anybody in the world to the yield of GYN screening. My sense is transvaginal ultrasound has been very disappointing, but we tend to do it anyway and probably should be rethinking that. Urinary tract surveillance in some cases does make sense, but again, no validated tests. I'm going to leave primary prevention to John Byrne, and this is, he must have this slide at least 3 or 4 times in his talk, and I'll let him do that. One of the things that I want to get on a soapbox about, one of the recommendations from the Blue Ribbon panel, first-degree relatives of these patients found to have a mismatch repair mutation should be given an opportunity to be screened and provided with genetic counseling to educate them about what screening entails, what it means, what actions they can take. Well, so the problem is, how do we reach these relatives? Why do we limit our attention to first-degree relatives? There are a lot of concerns with what I call provider-mediated outreach, concerns about HIPAA violation if we reach out to relatives, and then financial burdens and challenges that exist. So the key issue here is cascade testing, identifying at-risk relatives and getting that information to them and getting them into the fold for counseling, testing, and screening. So my understanding, and Heather and other genetic counselors in the room, you know, please shout out if I'm wrong about this, but my sense is that the standard of care in the U.S. is that when a mismatch repair mutation is detected, the index patient is simply given a more or less detailed handout, a copy of the mutation, and urged to share it with their relatives. We kind of, you know, smack them on the fanny on their way out and say, go share this with your relatives, good luck, and then we cross our fingers and hope for the best. But a lot of these patients don't really understand the technical complexity. We do a survey an hour later and we discover they've already forgotten half of what we told them. So now we expect them to somehow translate that to their families. Good luck with that. They may not really understand the risk to their distant relatives, and I think most importantly, dysfunctional relationships, people being cut off from their family, or simply not having their current mailing address or other contact information. As providers, some of us don't understand these complex diseases either. And our practice model, and this is why I'm really glad that we're at least talking about adopting a more public health approach, my practice model does not go beyond the patient in front of me. You know, I don't believe that I have a responsibility as a medical practitioner to this person's brother and sister. I can do a lot of exhorting, and I can say, oh, you should do this, and you should have them come in, but I have no real legal responsibility to that relative unless, again, I'm from one of those states that has a, quote, duty to warn. I'm not going to get into those details. But even if I did want to do that, we don't have the resources and time. We have no infrastructure for reaching out to relatives, and we can always retreat, and I see this all the time, and it really upsets me. Dear colleagues say, well, I'd love to do this, but gee, I don't think my institution will allow it. Doesn't it violate HIPAA if I do that? You know, and a lot of confusion over the guiding legal principles behind this. So there is some good news. In South Australia, which has really a health ministry model that we don't have in this country, the health ministry undertook many years ago now, over 10 years ago, to reach out to relatives. And basically, they simply had patients who were found to have a mutation, BRCA, mismatch repair, fill out a questionnaire that listed their relatives and their contact information, and the health ministry talked to their lawyers and said, hey, if we have them do that, is it okay that we, reach out to these relatives? And they said, well, collect a little bit of data on how they feel about it. They did that. It was okay. So they reach out to the relatives on behalf of the patient, but it's done by the health ministry, and it's been very well received. And so the data showed that they essentially doubled the number of at-risk relatives that were identified and were able to come forward for screening, counseling, and appropriate testing by accomplishing this direct provider-mediated outreach to relatives of these patients. So, but that was, that was a while ago, and they still do it with pen and paper, and, we just don't do things that way anymore. Everything's done online. So what we're proposing is a web-based family outreach. We have a model that's been developed, a program, a lot of issues. We can talk about that with the actual software of it, but it allows, and our institutional compliance lawyers have signed off on the issues of online consent, online authentication of patients, and so we have a process, at least, subject to some of the software, a process in place where we can replicate what's been done in South Australia for direct outreach to relatives, and this is kind of what the face page of that looks like. Patients log on, give us their usual family history, we identify a mutation, we come back and ask them to list all of their relatives, and then we just send an email saying, follow this link back to it, and here's the information about the mutation in your family, and please give us additional information about other people in your family. And this is kind of our own little algorithm about how that works. Again, provision for an e-consent has passed HIPAA muster. Our compliance lawyers have said this is fine, but I think we'll refight this battle at every institution. We understand there's a lot of other issues, security, firewalls, and so forth, but we are working through all of these. Lastly, this demonstration project would establish a network of individuals and families. Don't know what that looks like. A lot of interesting, provocative ways in which that could be done, possibly even through linkage of electronic medical records, different networks for different purposes, who's the honest broker in all of this. The devil is in the details. But obviously one of the goals is to facilitate trials, whether they be chemoprevention, whether they be efforts to look at genotype, phenotype, or others. And to conclude, I think the issues raised by the Blue Ribbon panel are generally on target. I think the emphasis on tumor testing may be yesterday's news, but I think coordination and demonstration efforts are timely, but there are questions of scope, cost, and stakeholders. And I did it on time. See, I showed you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think that's a tough act to follow, largely because you were on time, so I'll try to be also in line with time. So thank you, everyone. On behalf of Fight Colorectal Cancer, I really want to say thank you all for inclusion of the advocacy community in the work. I'm Andy Dwyer. I'm particularly in a role with Fight CRC with the University of Colorado around the advocate voice, and part of the reason I think this whole idea of public health and working with the survivor community and the like, is that with my work at University of Colorado, I really noted that a lot of the advocacy organizations had the ear of patients, and a lot of the work I started to do was really thinking about the dissemination strategy and how could we work with advocacy to really inform our work. So I just want to say, when I'm thinking about working with Fight CRC, who they are as an organization, the idea is really thinking about advocacy, supporting patients and families, as well as how to improve research and empower patients to raise their voice. So while we're working in terms of distribution of materials and information, and then thinking further with a lot of the work of social media in the advocacy realm, we're talking about a group who can actually capitalize and have 90 million impressions through the month of March as CRC Awareness Month. So you want to talk about people who are really capturing the voice. We're talking about the advocacy organizations who are really working there, and I'm really proud to be a part of an organization that's doing this in an exemplary fashion. So as I noted, part of the reason, or part of the real aim with working with Fight CRC is because they do drive policy at the national, and I think now, given the current changes in the administration, probably more so even at the state level going forward, as also really thinking about how to include survivors and advocates in terms of empowering them to really help inform the science, the research, as well as the promotion and materials that are developed for them going in the future to help better serve their families, their patients in the area of survivorship as well as prevention. Fight CRC particularly serves late-stage colorectal cancer survivors, so not just the Lynch population, but a heterogeneous group of people who are really facing cancer as a chronic condition and really thinking about how do they advocate. Through work at the through Call on Congress, working nationally, they really drive policy level, for instance, movement of the 21st Century Cures, helping with research and DoD funding, as well as a huge awareness campaign, which I noted their reach and their breadth. So part of the thing that they've also really worked towards is really thinking about how do we help inform the research agenda, raise money to help further this initiative. And one of the things I'm very excited to hear, to say, is that right now at this time, they're really thinking about how do they move forward research in the area of primary prevention, also in areas of immunotherapy, even looking at things like Lynch syndrome and how to really include the survivor voice in this work. So when I talked a little bit about the number of people who are really engaging, we see about 4,000 to 5,000 people who are engaged as research advocates. Many of these are people who live with genetic and familial history or familial syndromes, and they're helping really engage in terms of looking at what the work and what's developing. So part of the work that we've done with Fight CRC to really look at this active engaged group is to really look at focus groups. So over the last year, year and a half that I've been engaged with Fight CRC is that we've been able to look at people who are overall a heterogeneous group of colorectal cancer survivors to ask what they wish they would have had, what they wish they would have known, as well as looking at a subset of patients who are Lynch families, Lynch survivors themselves, to ask really what are the services they need, what they wish they had, what they would have wished they would have known. And I think what we're starting to see in terms of the qualitative data, and this is pre-publication and we're still working on developing a lot of this work, but I think what we're starting to see is some real themes in terms of interest in people wanting to ensure that the provider knowledge is increased. So need for providers about Lynch syndrome and family history of colorectal cancer. One of the emerging themes I think that we're hearing predominantly is that if you're not part of an NCI center in terms of treatment, if you're not with a very specialized group, oftentimes the chance of really have genetic counseling, genetic testing, or that sort of consult isn't typically happening with the general primary care oncology field. And so there's a lot of resentment, I think, within patients wanting to really have this information and making sure that it's not just the select few who have this information, and it's more disseminable in terms of the patients having access to this information. In terms of surveillance and care coordination, I think we did hear earlier as well, and we heard from Dr. Lynch, is that there's a lot of people who really want the treatment summary, survivorship care plans, but they want that to include information about what is their surveillance for screening, what should they be telling family members, and that it can't be a quote-unquote affectionately referred to as boring piece of paper. It needs to be something that really is interactive and that is something that has things like the network that was put forth in terms of thinking about an online opportunity for people to engage with family members and the like. So we really think about how do we this surveillance and care coordination piece. And then I think one of the resounding pieces that we're hearing is the psychosocial needs. All of the people that we've spoken to, specifically who are Lynch survivors, talk about some level of PTSD, not just when, if and when, or if the colorectal cancer diagnosis would happen, but when. And so thinking about this other idea of the foot to drop, and what does this mean in terms of their surveillance, and how scared and how much work should they be doing to really work to promote this information to family members, as well as their own surveillance. And back to that surveillance and care coordination piece, being a bit unclear about when and how. In terms of thinking about the other areas of PTSD and even thinking about worries and concerns, as people often refer to, it was the whole idea of passing on this information, the genetic predisposition, and people being very concerned about the shame, the guilt, and how to communicate this to family members. So I think in the time that we've been collecting information over the last year, these are really the areas that we're seeing some real area that survivors, as well as Lynch syndrome patients themselves, are really dealing with. So in terms of some notable quotes from patients, and I thought that this was really important to share, really the voice of what we were hearing, is that a lot of times when they would talk to, when they would refer to the medical community, they would often provide, or actually note that providers had never heard of Lynch syndrome. They don't treat it, or they downplay it as if it's not as serious as this BRCA mutation. So that's one thing that I think I heard predominantly from folks, is that the breast cancer community has really done a lot around awareness of BRCA. A lot of times these patients were having to actually educate their providers about Lynch. And so it was a little off-putting and a little just kind of wondering, why isn't the CRC community doing a good job like the breast cancer community in getting out the awareness? There are a lot of people who don't have access to hereditary clinics and genetic counselors, and this is also a resounding theme, as I mentioned earlier. And then the other thing that I think is coming from this group is a lot of people who are really motivated to join Lynch syndrome focus groups are people who are actually frustrated to say the colorectal cancer wasn't their first primary, it was a second, and they were oftentimes hoping that they would have had genetic counseling, genetic testing early in their first stage to maybe help them with the prevention or surveillance for a secondary disease. And one of the things that I should note is that everyone mentions that ultimately at the time of diagnosis that there's a lot going on, and that it's oftentimes communicated to them that they have so much happening that the doctor or care provider wouldn't have provided information about genetic counseling or testing at the time of diagnosis, at the time of treatment, because it was assumed that it was a burden. And this was basically the response from many folks to say, it wasn't, I wish I would have known, and these are things that we really need to change in terms of care and care delivery. About a couple of weeks back, I was actually at a survivorship conference and asked this question about, you know, what's the general information around the uptake of genetic counseling and screening in young adults who have solid tumor. And I did even at that time get response from some of the folks saying, you know, it's not something we actually monitor because at the time of diagnosis, it's really a lot going on for patients. So, and again, where there's a little bit of a direct conflict with what we're hearing from the patient community and provider community, and these are areas that we hope that we can influence in terms of care delivery going forward. So in terms of the emerging issues and rising to the challenge, one of the things, or several of the things that I think that we as a community, as an advocacy organization, are really helping to inform around the patient education as well as policy realm is really thinking about this guilt portion and the passing on to family members. This is something that comes up predominantly, how we message, how we share information about communication between Lynch survivors and family members, and even how that actually influences testing, I think is something that's going to make a huge impact going forward. A lot of times, and I think Lisa, in your slide showing really that it's really interpersonal, connected, and the like, what we heard from a lot of Lynch survivors is it was harder to deal with the diagnosis of a child or even people who are co-survivors for a spouse going through it. It's actually just as hard, if not harder, to really see this impact on families. And then I think actually Kathy mentioned this at the outset. Really what we are hearing from a number of people based on gender, based on race, ethnicity, and age, there is really a need and a request and desire from folks to really have information that is targeted to underserved communities and really thinking about the appropriateness of Lynch testing and what kind of information we should be sharing, that information is targeted and tailored to specific individuals. So again, this is information that we're working on. These are some of the developing themes. We're hoping to go ahead and submit this for peer review publication. We'd like to share more of the information that we're learning from the focus groups based on genetic and familial histories going forward. But I think it's a huge opportunity in that a number of the people who are really engaged with Fight CRC are very much interested in working towards focus group, developing materials, helping drive the policy agenda, and really working with the medical community as opposed to in conflict. And I think there's a difference between informing the work and sharing their experience versus being, you know, maybe conflicting head-on. But I think what I hear from a lot of survivors as well as the advocacy organizations is it's going to really take all of us to do this work together. The other thing I just want to mention in closing is Fight CRC is one of the groups who does this work in this domain. There's actually a number of people and a number of organizations that are directly targeted towards Lynch syndrome specific. So I have Lynch Syndrome International, Hereditary Colon Cancer Foundation, Genetic Alliance, Alive and Kicking. These are some of the groups who've done some dedicated work informing in terms of patient and survivor opportunities as well as policy work as well. I want to make a quick note for those of you who might not be aware, the HEROIC registry that the Genetic Alliance and Alive and Kicking is actually putting together is a patient-driven registry, and this is something that I think that they're really working towards understanding with if and how patients will interact with a directory that's built for them, and how medical providers and researchers will be engaged in this sort of work. And then, of course, Lisa Schrager and Forth with their work around registries and use of advocacy is something that we're keenly interested in continuing to work with. And I know that NCI and the Office of Advocacy plans to include all of us more going forward in this work, and we really appreciate that opportunity. So thank you guys so much. It's been a great pleasure to share this work, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of our findings and continuing to collaborate with all of you.
So I'm Rick Boland, and I'm going to start the discussion. And I don't have any slides because I wanted to hear what people were saying and then respond to that. So let me say this. I think that Lynch syndrome is the model genetic disease for us to understand how to do precision prevention. First of all, it's the commonest of all of the hereditary predispositions to cancer of any kind. So we got lots of patients. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation once and said it was 1 in 350, and everybody said, oh, that's too much. The Iceland study says it's 1 in 200. Here's the issue. We're still coming to grips with penetrance. And so Lynch syndrome is the disease caused by a germline mutation in a DNA mismatch repair gene. It doesn't mean you have to have cancer to have that. So first of all, it's really common, and we should be able to get plenty of patients to study. This disease has some of the textbook features for us to study. This got the issue of genetic heterogeneity. We got 4 genes that cause one syndrome. There's genetic pleiotrophy, too. We've got multiple organs that are at risk for cancer. And we've got this issue of variable penetrance. And this is something we've got to nail down for us to really get good preventive strategies together. First of all, we got penetrance issues that we don't yet understand based upon what mutation there is in each gene. Then there's the issue of each of the genes acts a little bit differently. Almost all the data that we have so far are based upon what happens with MSH2 and MLH1. Now we find out that MSH6 and PMS2 are probably more common than those others. Let me say that again. They're probably more common than MSH2 and MLH1. The penetrance is lower, and we just don't recognize it. And this first hit me when the biallelic studies came out. We realized that biallelic mismatch repair deficiency is mainly driven by PMS2 and MSH6. And the only good explanation for that is, there's 2 explanations, but the best one is that they're really the most common. Now, a couple of things that I think that we should come to grips with in the demonstration project, which I think should be much more robust than maybe some people are thinking about it. We should really get a good look at the modifier genes. So we got one issue of penetrance that has to do with what the gene is and what the mutation is in that gene. But how about the modifier genes? We don't talk about that very much. So there's like 4 different classes of modifier genes, and they've been fairly well studied. One group are cell cycle modulators like cyclin D1 and P53. They modify when you get your cancer, depending and what the age of onset is. And then there's the xenobiotic metabolizing genes, the cytochrome P450, NAT2, etc. Those. There are a bunch of, the third group is a bunch of other genes, NOD2, the hemochromatosis genes, and then there are non-genetic, there are non-gene-based SNPs on 8q and 11q, and they've all been shown to modify the age of onset and the penetrance, and yet none of them is currently actionable. And so I think what we need to do is have enough people in which we know what they have. So we need to get blood, you get germline information, and it's going to be a fairly massive informatics exercise. But I mean, it's 2017. We can do this. We just need to really get going on it. The next thing is we've got all of this really interesting epigenetic stuff going on. We've got that are mainly confounders. We got methylation of MLH1, the major confounder that everybody knows about, but then there's a real Lynch syndrome-like disease, genome-wide methylation of MLH1. Acts like Lynch syndrome, it's just not inherited. There's also biallelic somatic mutations that occur that will be a confounder for Lynch syndrome. And so this is an area that we can study. And I don't know whether everybody in the room is aware of this, but if you take a look at methylation in general, in sporadic tumors, and then in the MLH1 methylated ones, they're the hypermethylated tumors. Sporadic tumors have some degree of methylation. There's less in young onset colon cancers, but Lynch syndrome's in between, and methylation is often a second hit. I think we really need to look a lot more at second hits, and they can be deletions, mutations, and methylation, because that will probably be the way we can really get into prevention. We need to know so you can't fix the underlying germline mutation. The key is to protect the other allele inherited from the non-affected parent. We also need to take a look at the issue of differential expression of the DNA mismatch repair genes. Specifically, they're cell cycle regulated, and there's different amounts of this. I got a time warning, so I can't get into that in much detail, but that might tell us something about prevention too. Oxidative stress reduces mismatch repair expression. That might be an important issue, and maybe we can link this to lifestyle issues. And then the last thing I want to mention is the whole issue of defective mismatch repair crypts, suggesting that people are generating frame shift peptides all through their lives. It's been shown that we make antibodies against these, and I think that this will lead us in some way into a really good prevention strategy with some type of immunization, if we can get a handle on that. So at this point, I'll just open it up for discussion. Yes, John.
While we get this on, okay. Just to push back on the tumor testing, does the emergence of pembrolizumab and the new therapeutic interventions push against your argument? In other words, will be MSI testing, because Frank and the guys need to know who's MSI high to put them on those drugs, so that will stop us moving away from tumor testing?
Not at all. That wasn't my point. The point I made, and I went lightning fast, tumor testing, I think, is here to stay, and it's going to happen anyway for a variety of reasons. The potential for underlying mismatch repair alterations is but one of many, because there are many important therapeutic targets that are being evaluated in tumor testing. So I think that if we are interested in relying on a tumor-based approach to identifying possible candidates for mismatch repair testing, it likely itself will be embedded in a much broader panel of testing for somatic mutations that is going to happen anyway. And I think that one of the key questions is, maybe the oncologist can speak to this, but I think in a cancer center, it's that much broader range of potentially actionable mutations that relate to therapy that are probably going to be what drives a more universal approach to tumor testing. I think that's a different conversation than the one about universal germline testing through a panel. There's probably some overlap, but I think people can and do have separate conversations about those two different points.
Yes.
Randy Heckman-Stoddard from the Breast and GYN Group in the Division of Cancer Prevention. The question is both for Patrick and for Andrea. Can both of you comment on your thoughts on the upper age limit for testing? So obviously we want to reduce the number of people we need to test in order and have higher predictive value. Can you comment on the upper age limit?
Well, I would just say briefly, to not have an upper age limit actually makes it easier, because you don't have to think about what that age limit is, number one. Number two, we are seeing, even in older people with not much of a family history, people with PMS2 and MSH6 and Lord knows what other mutations, the question is whether it's cost effective. We're lucky to have people like Uri Lautebaum here who thinks and researches carefully about issues of what's really cost effective. Sure, we can find them, but you know, what is the cut point in terms of what's really cost effective in doing so. And of course, those of us that deal with these patients in the clinic, you know, you find some 80-year-old guy that's got a PMS2 mutation and nobody in the family has had colon cancer but him, you know, what do you know, and you test that guy's children who are, you know, 45, 50 years old and they have a mutation, how much higher do you tell them that their risk really is? You know, that's, you know, an entire area that we need to come to grips with is how do we rationalize making screening recommendations to those that are at risk and detected to have these mutations when they are so low penetrant. And that's where I think Rick's point about we need to understand the biology of things that interact to account for that low penetrance are worth doing. So there's several different issues that come up.
Just to add to that, Patrick, there are two components, I think, to your question. One would be tumor testing in an older person, which we might continue to do anyway because of the new therapies. And the other would be germline testing, which is a whole other issue about doing a germline test on an 85-year-old is maybe not the best expenditure of funds.
You know, I think right now, is that, okay, there we go. I think that in terms of even the patient community understanding to a certain extent, I think the guidelines are fairly complex in terms of even the difference between counseling and the need for testing. I think to a certain extent we're really fairly young in terms of even the upper age limit being part of that we'll have to describe and discuss. But to a certain extent, it feels at this time that really a lot of the issue is really just around when the genetic testing should happen, just getting the basics out. I think one of the areas that we struggle with for preventative screening, of course, is even upper age limit of screening and surveillance recommendations as well. And so even those sort of upper limits are something that we're currently trying to work towards and understanding to the point around population health and how does that all fit. I think that we're having those conversations now. We haven't gotten quite that far in terms of the genetic testing upper limit, but I do think the point around tumor testing and what does that mean for younger individuals has a very different implication. But still, I think those are some things that are fairly nuanced for where we're at. The other thing, however, I would say is that essentially right now, the one thing that I think patients are noting a lot of difficulty is ultimately if you've had the test done 5-10 years ago, do you have to have genetic testing again, panel testing, and when do you age out? And those are some of the things that are starting to come in terms of that general area. But the upper age limit is really, I think, something that we're almost there, but not quite in terms of really dealing with.
Yes.
Barry Kramer, Division of Cancer Prevention, NCI. So those were 3 outstanding presentations. And maybe this is just a question that is related to your comments, Rick, but it gets to the issue of tumor-based testing versus germline testing, universal testing versus some form of focused testing. But could one or all of you summarize what is known about the cumulative absolute risk of cancer associated with Lynch syndrome mutations in families that do versus don't have any of the sentinel malignancies that would raise suspicion?
So let me speak to that. So the question is, what are the lifetime risks for various cancers given a mutation? Probably the best
but the dichotomy is in a family that has a cancer versus one that doesn't, and not even a proband.
Okay, so if I understand the data from Paul Muller and the European Consortium on surveillance and detection of cancer in mutation carriers is probably the best data, and every better set of data that comes out on the cancer incidence in relation to screening tends to show a slightly, lower and lower penetrance for cancer than the study before. So originally we talked about lifetime risks of colon cancer in the range of 80 to 100%, but that is way the upper limit. It's probably more in the range of 30 to 50% or so, depending on which gene is altered and how effective the screening is. And that's just for colorectal. We don't really know about the other cancers. If I understood, if your question was you find a mutation in somebody who hasn't had cancer, we are starting to find that, but we're only finding that really with panel testing. Maybe
not the likelihood of finding a mutation, but basically the cumulative risk
right.
of getting cancer.
Right. We have no idea, and that's probably an important. So I showed examples, an example of a worried well woman that turns up with a PMS2 mutation with no history of colon cancer in the family. I think this is where a registry would come in because we need a lot of those in order to answer that question. Right now, I feel very confident in giving this answer, and the answer is I have no idea.
So, but, I just saw a paper.
Improve on I have no idea.
Yeah, there's a paper I just found yesterday. I've got it right at my desk, at my chair. I'll show it to you. And it was that very issue, a prospective study. Now, it was a mix of different people, but some of them were just found with a germline mutation. And I think that we're not going to really answer this question until we understand penetrance better in general. But I'm not sure it's going to be much different whether you had a positive family history or not. And, we got all these things. Nobody knows their family history, so it seems. And we have problems of false paternity, and the rest of that really confound things. And I think that ultimately we'll probably get to the bottom of this with population-wide testing, maybe imputational genetics and that kind of thing. And I think family history, Patrick's right. That's where we start. But it's really a pretty weak tool, I think. Yes.
Hi, I'm Amy Lossie. I'm at the Genetics, Epigenetics, and Developmental Neuroscience branch at NIDA, but I'm here actually as a Lynch syndrome patient. So I was diagnosed 2 years ago. My family has no history of colon cancer. I'm the first person in my family with colon cancer. Everybody had, my grandfather had prostate cancer. My mom had very early stage cervical cancer. So it was really quite a shock. In some regards. But as a geneticist and actually as an epigeneticist, I really want to talk about developing methodologies to do gene-by-gene interactions, network analyses, incorporating epigenetics into that. Something we're looking at NIDA, how do we do that? And how do we, in this sort of heterogeneous sort of syndrome, it's really hard to diagnose that. What's the difference in my background genetics that gives me colon cancer versus my mom having cervical cancer? This is really how we need to start finding this out. What's my specific MSH2 mutation? How's that going to be, predispose me to something versus someone else's MLH1 or someone else's MSH2 mutation? So I can't stress enough the importance of this first session today for me as a patient and as a geneticist to how we need to work forward and go through this. And so, whatever we need to do, if you can look me up, I'm happy to talk to you too.
Well, just from a personal perspective, I come from a pretty big MSH2 family, and we've got a whole flock of people in their 20s who have had colon cancer. We've got other people who carry the exact same mutation who have gotten into their 60s with no cancer.
Exactly.
And I think we've got, the information's out there.
Right.
It must be some combination of modifier genes and environmental exposures. Right. We can figure it out. We just have to have the will to make it happen.
Hi, I'm Lisa Schlager with FORCE, Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowered. Thank you for the shout out, Andy. I am a BRCA1 mutation carrier, and I represent the hereditary cancer community through our work at FORCE. Originally, we focused on BRCA mutations, but now with the growth in multi-gene panel testing, we've broadened our mission to provide support and education to anyone affected by hereditary cancer. And I just want to pose a question, and that is whether or not we're kind of missing the boat by focusing in on Lynch, for instance, in a silo, versus the broader picture of hereditary cancers and hereditary cancer syndromes. With multi-gene panel testing, we're finding a lot more crossover. BRCA families, for mine, for instance, has some colon cancer, has thyroid cancer, has pancreatic cancer, and so when people go in for these gene panel tests, they come back with a surprising result. Somebody who looked like they have Lynch has BRCA and vice versa. So I think if we're going to have these registries and these demonstration projects, we need to be a little more open to taking a broader look at how all of these overlap and interact. And I guess my question is, how can that be addressed, or how could that be accommodated through a demonstration project such as this?
Sounds like an Andy question to me.
I think, Lisa, the thing that we're hearing from patients as well is that I think that perhaps panel testing is something that people would really actually appreciate moreover, because I think that I'm sorry, can you hear?
Get a little closer.
Oh, good, get a little closer. This is the first time anyone's ever told me they couldn't hear me. So, so I think that what we're hearing, at least through the focus groups and the qualitative work we're doing right now, to your point, is that there, especially a number of the people are second primaries or recurrent. I do think that there's a lot of question about the interplay. I think about ultimately risk reduction for other cancers as well in the screening. So I feel like that the people who are noting at least Lynch families, they also have a heavier sense of activation and really the need to know. So I would say from the psychosocial impact and looking at the need of what patients are expressing, the the panel testing is probably something that the general community we're hearing would like more of.
I agree. I just want to have that taken into account. And then as far as the cost effectiveness comment earlier, from our community, the feeling is that testing the older relative is absolutely of value because it informs cascade testing, which therefore gives information to all of the younger generations, and that's important information for their health care.
Thank you.
Great.
Sudhir?
Rick, this is a question for you and also for Patrick. You talked about precision prevention, and for precision prevention, we need precision detection. Since Amsterdam criteria and Bethesda guidelines are no longer useful, I think they are still useful in some context. Do we have a consensus on testing for HNPCC that could lead us for the precision prevention? For example, you have option of IC, you have the option for NGS, all kind of technology with some drawbacks in each of them. How one will, so do we have in a community, do we have any consensus on those testings?
Well, every time I've been at a meeting when all of the people get together who think about this a lot, I hear universal testing of all colon cancers as the starting point. But I think that, Patrick raised the issue about considering doing panel testing. And, what's interesting is the first time I sent out a genetic test for MSH2, it cost $1,650. Now you can get everything for less than that. The first time that the hospital that I was at the time was doing immunohistochemistry, that was $1,000 for 4 slides that I could read. And so the cost is, the costs are changing so dramatically, and next-gen sequencing makes panel testing reasonable. The thing is, we don't have enough data yet to interpret all those results we get back. So, Patrick, maybe you have another take, but I heard you say maybe we should start off with panel testing early.
It's simply, you asked, is there consensus? And I would say, there is consensus today, but it's an evolving consensus. The consensus, and this was my concern about some of the recommendations from the Blue Ribbon panel, that the idea of how do we best achieve universal tumor testing is, I think, yesterday's consensus. I think we're evolving into a new consensus already, and we want to make sure that we don't run the risk of devoting resources to answering questions that we probably already have the answers to. Yeah, maybe there's more effective implementation and rollout, but if there are even better, easier technologies, that may be kind of a moot point.
So I'm glad that you said it about some shortcomings in Blue Ribbon panel, because I also felt the same way. Because this is a implementation plan where you need to have something like a shovel ready and you can do the demonstration project. To me, it's still the biology in many aspects are not known, and we need to know more about it. So I'm curious to hear the next 2 days about what we can do in terms of Blue Ribbon panel implementation. Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
So I'm going to be very quick. Since there's so much discussion about penetrance, I wanted to put in an NCI funding plug, there is a open funding opportunity through the Provocative Questions Initiative to look at disease penetrance for high-risk alleles. And so I highly encourage the researchers in the room to apply for this funding opportunity. Barbara Dunn and I serve on the committee that oversees this Provocative Questions, and Stephanie Nelson from DCCPS oversees the team. So if you have any questions, we're happy to talk to you about it.
Terrific.
Hi, my name is Megan Myers, and I'm from the University of California in San Francisco, and I'm a genetic counselor there. And one of the things is I'm seeing lots of patients in the clinic, and unfortunately, it's really easy for me to test a woman for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome who's unaffected. She only needs a second-degree relative with, breast or ovarian cancer. But when I have a patient who is unaffected with a colon cancer in the family, it's much, much more challenging, and I can almost always get them tested based on, HBOC guidelines, but with NCCN, as we're saying, Amsterdam and Bethesda are sort of out of the picture now, yet that's still what we have to refer to when I'm looking for NCCN guidelines. So I think that's the discussion that really needs to be talking about how can we change our NCCN guidelines, because it is challenging. So I am offering all my patients an 84-gene panel. It doesn't matter what they're coming in with, affected or unaffected. So I just wanted to bring up, we really need to be looking at our guidelines because it's really limiting, providers as to what we can offer our patients in terms of testing, especially since we were talking about lower penetrance and things like that. So that's just more sort of food for thought. And then I also wanted to bring up, I really want to applaud, your amazing advocacy group. I've actually, along with many other people at UCSF, have developed a family communication tool called KinTalk. And so basically, it's not just for Lynch syndrome, but it's for any hereditary cancer syndrome group, and it's not a closed family communication site. It's for any institution can use it, and we have 800 members right now around the world, and there's discussions about both Lynch syndrome and about hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. We're starting to include things like CHEK2, ATM, PALB2, as we're finding these are becoming more and more common. We also have a moderated piece of the site, so I'm actually on the website answering questions for people who come on. You don't have to be a UCSF patient. And then we have the family communication portal where people can actually upload their genetic testing information, family letters. We've just created templates for dear family member sort of letters so people can actually use these letters if they haven't received them from their doctors themselves, as we know that unfortunately, more and more people are just being tested by, primary care providers and not receiving the counseling that they need through genetic counselors. So if anybody has any questions about this, I think it's a really great resource, especially, for those communities. And
just to haul away the carcass of this dead horse that we've been beating, the Amsterdam criteria were developed to find families that might have Lynch syndrome, and it worked. We got reagent quality families, we found the genes. The Bethesda criteria were developed to determine which tumors should be tested for microsatellite instability. It's done, we test them all now. So we don't ever have to discuss them again. They were useful, they worked. But now we have different ways. The panels have really changed the whole thing. The affordable panels have changed the whole calculus here.
Okay, this is, I believe, an extension of what Dr. Lynch has been talking about, testing the tumor itself. Extends it to a larger venue. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think this is an extension of what Dr. Lynch has talked about multiple times today. Does tumor testing for precision medicine, the hot term, which is now being implemented broadly in the healthcare system, does it offer an opportunity to identify potential Lynch families, people that we should be thinking about? In other words, we have this other idea of tumor testing. Will that help us identify?
Well, sure, it potentially can. As I said, MLH1 has been embedded in these panels for quite a long time. But as we know, 80% of the case, if you take a population-based approach, as many as 80% of all the MLH1 mutants are going to be somatic and will not really inform underlying likelihood of mismatch repair. And I think it's a very simple undertaking to include all of the genes and so one can address that while doing the much broader precision medicine target. But again, I think for detecting mutations, we have to be willing to have the two conversations at the same time. You know, what is the role of tumor-based testing in its own right, and you know, is that really going to efficiently get at the issue of identifying all the cases with HNPCC, or as has already been mentioned, a lot of times these people with what may look like HNPCC turn out to have a BRCA mutation that is not going to be identified by tumor-based testing, at least not that's focused on the usual mismatch repair genes. So again, I think there is some overlap, but they're separate conversations.
I want to thank wonderful introductory speakers to this conference. It was a great session and discussant. I think that set the scene. This is a very complex issue. It needs to be broader, and we all have families that, when we're doing this, that come in with one thing and you're surprised that you find Lynch or other syndromes. So I think this really has been very valuable for setting the tone. Thank you for keeping on time. We're going to break now until 10 after 10, and then we'll come back for the next session. Thank you very much.